Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a very busy agenda this afternoon. Thank you all for joining, and thank you to Ondine Wells for organizing the agenda and assembling a great set of faculty to talk about stakeholder engagement. The primary purpose for this is to make sure that all our STRIDE projects have a very strong stakeholder engagement. The motivation for this is that we want to make sure that the USDOT and all our partners are well aware of the type of work that we do. We want to make sure that our research is as relevant as possible. And so in order to do that, what we decided to do is to have a webinar for our faculty and our PIs to provide some examples of different ways stakeholder engagement is happening. And so we have some great presentations for people who have done stakeholder engagement within their projects. I'm going to turn it over to Ondine, and she's going to talk about the webinar and some feedback that we've got from the USDOT, and then she'll get the agenda rolling.
So I'm going to briefly go over the feedback that we received from USDOT prior to this webinar. We did invite Cesar Singh, the director of the UTC Grants Program, and Dawn Tucker-Thomas, our grant manager, to participate in the webinar because they were involved in the recompete process, they declined to participate. However, they gave us some great feedback, and so I want to share that with you. The first thing is that they were very excited that we were focusing on stakeholder engagement and that this was a really important part of tech transfer. So they were excited that we were hosting this webinar today. They also wanted to make sure that all PIs are familiar with this primer, which I've provided a link to. This gives you a very good overview of tech transfer. It's 20 pages. It's a very easy to read document. If you haven't read it, definitely take a look at it. I'm going to give you a couple of highlights as well from that. One of the things that the primer says is that tech transfer should be integrated with all phases of the project. And so there are four objectives that we need to look at when we're thinking about tech transfer. One is that we really want to understand potential adopters' needs. Those are your stakeholders, one type of stakeholder. We want to understand how the technology being developed could meet those needs. We want to address potential barriers to adoption and also communicate the value of adopting that technology in question. Now, we understand that a lot of STRIDE projects don't actually result in new technology. It might be a methodology or an algorithm or a process. It doesn't have to be a technology, but what we're looking for is ways to have whatever comes out of your research project being adopted and used. So another thing that the USDOT let us know is that in general, UTCs have done a great job coordinating with local and state officials with their projects. And in some cases, projects have gone beyond government stakeholders. So examples that they noted were trade associations and bike enthusiasts. And that really depends on the topic of your project. But they really like to see diversity. So when you're able to reach beyond the local and state officials, that's great. Again, the primer talks about the types of stakeholders that you might consider engaging. And I won't go through this whole table. You can look at the primer and get more information. But you can see that there are people who are going to be early adopters, and they're going to have different contributions than, say, technical experts. So you really want to think about having a diversity in your type of stakeholders and see at different points they might be important to your project. And the last thing which both Noreen and Carrie have touched on is that they're very interested in hearing the impact of COVID on your projects. So two questions in particular related to stakeholders. Number one is, how are you engaging stakeholders in light of COVID? So the way that you're engaging them, has it changed? And the second thing is, have the needs of your stakeholders and their priorities changed in light of COVID? And so I think you'll see through these presentations that there are definitely changes in stakeholder needs and priorities. So if you can highlight those things in your reports, that really helps USDOT to understand how we're responding to COVID and to the changing needs resulting from COVID. So for that, I'm going to go ahead and transfer it back to our presenters.
Well, thanks everybody. Thanks to Ondine and Lily for organizing this. So there were really things, when we talked about this subject of stakeholder engagement, there were 3 reflections that I had that I wanted to share. And the first one is the one that's been most meaningful and most useful to me. And that is that connecting with existing networks and existing actors in whatever space you're working in is really critical. And the reason for this is, as researchers, we don't necessarily have that active network to practitioners, but for most areas that we're working in, there are existing nonprofit groups who are dedicated and have very, very active networks. And if we link into them, we can really sort of make our research ripple. And so that for me has been one of the most important lessons. And so I'll give 2 examples of how I've tried to apply this in my own work. So a lot of my work has been on children's travel and on school transportation. And on those 2 issues, it was really critical to connect both with governmentally USDOT funded Center on Safe Routes to School. So that's the National Center for Safe Routes to School, as well as a leading nonprofit group. And so that's the Safe Routes to School National Partnership. And so by working with them, I was able to, both improve my choice of research topic by understanding the holes that they were seeing in practice. And when I had results to disseminate, I could link into their networks. So I would do webinars with them. We would do policy briefs with them. And it meant that there was just infinitely more amplification compared to me doing those efforts on my own through my department, or perhaps by putting it on my website. And so that's the first example that I wanted to share. And that's an example of working with larger scale national groups. More recently, I've been connecting with actors in the area of medical transportation. And so that means getting people to dialysis, doctor appointments, those types of things. And here now we're actually focused not so much on connecting with national groups on this topic, but we really connected with an existing group of practitioners that had already come together in our county on medical transportation. So there already existed a medical transportation working group that has representatives from Duke Health, from UNC Health, from all of our 4 or so regional providers of transportation services, as well as our social service agencies. So for us now, working with this small group has been very beneficial. We've been able to continue doing dissemination work through them. We've done webinars for that group that then get amplified out to the rest of the state through their networks. And we've also connected with them very substantively on our research. We bring them in as an advisory group on a lot of the projects that we're working in, so that we embed the stakeholder feedback from the start. So those 2 examples, one much more focused at the national level, the other focused at a very local level, where engaging with stakeholders has, I think, really made our research better and been very important for us. And I think the takeaway that I would say there is, it was in both those cases really worth our time looking around and finding out what groups already existed rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. The second point that I wanted to make is thinking about when engaging may have some risks, and being aware of that. And so, as I mentioned, our recent work has been in the space of medical transportation, and both Uber and Lyft are entering this marketplace very aggressively. And so we had experiences actually with really with both companies where we were talking to people from either organization, and it became clear that we were sort of seen potentially as conduits or a way to connect with the hospital, who would be selecting a provider for some of their medical transportation services. You know, there's nothing wrong with that, but it did mean to us that we recognized how carefully we had to tread with relationships with partnering there, and think about where the lines were in terms of what collaboration could look like. So I do want to point out that particularly as transportation has more and more private sector actors, and there may be financial considerations both on research funding, you know, the private sector actors are funding some incredibly innovative relationships, and those are critical to moving all of our agendas forward. But it is important to think through the implications, and just as these conversations are maybe a little bit more ahead of the curve on the medical side, thinking about there may be opportunities for partnership. What does it look like if there's a funding arrangement? How is just everything very, very transparent? And also making sure you're up on your own campus's financial conflict of interest guidelines. The third comment that I wanted to make was about COVID impacts on stakeholders, and this was something that Ondine had asked us to think about. What we've found is that the impacts on connections with professionals have been very, very limited. As I said, we've continued to do webinars. We're continue to be able to connect with some of our stakeholders whose jobs are the reason that they're engaging with us. So they're doing it during their business hours on a work provided computer. They likely have good internet at home. And so we have not really faced very many barriers there, aside from the ones we all face with doing things virtually. But we have been looking to incorporate more patient perspectives in our work, and that has been impacted by COVID. We were actually just set to do some work with patients in February, and you know, because of COVID, that never got off the ground, and now it's very difficult to think about how to restart that because of the complications. So for us, it's mattered a great deal who the stakeholders are in terms of how COVID has impacted their ability to spend time on our work. So I hope that those 3 points are helpful for you to consider as you come up with your own engagement plans. So just to reiterate, one, focusing on utilizing existing networks or organizations, and then being careful about, or thoughtful, I guess maybe would be a better way of saying it, when you're connecting, particularly with private sector, but really with any financial entity. And then thinking about how COVID is impacting who can interact and be engaged in our work. So thanks very much.
So the projects that I'm going to talk about, part of them were actually done in partnership with Noreen, and I see Eleni is also on the line, and Billy, and I'm not sure if Ruth was here, but she's also been working on these. I'm going to talk about my particular part of these projects, but I think there's a wealth of information from both of them, from all of our folks. So in particular, what I've been focused on the last couple of years is transit ridership change, and sort of understanding what's been causing a lot of change that's been occurring before COVID, and now basically all of these problems have been amplified post-COVID. So there's a wealth of work to be done here. But I think, so just to give some background, this is a graphic that shows how transit ridership has changed since 1990. And you can see that in general, rail was increasing, bus has had its ups and downs. Both of them have been down in the last 5 to 10 years in big ways, ways that are pretty scary to the industry, and that's part of the catalyst for all of this work. The work that I'm talking about, I and others were part of STRIDE Project G and A2, so transit in the era of shared mobility and changing access to public transportation and the potential for increased travel. With those projects, I worked with MARTA, which is our local transit agency in Atlanta, and they actually came forward with match funding. So I'm going to talk about the MARTA project as well, but these three kind of all go together. Then in addition to that, I've done some more recent work for the Transit Cooperative Research Program. So I'm going to jump into that a little bit and talk about our project, the outreach components of our project, recent declines in public transportation ridership, analysis, causes, and responses. And then yippee for us, we just got news about a week ago that we won one of the new UTCs. Ours is called T-Score, and it's also about transit ridership change. So depending, I might touch on that a little bit too. And I actually am gonna set myself a timer. I forgot to hit it at 10, but we'll take a minute away already, so.
Congratulations, by the way, Kari, and that's great news. And we should make sure that we coordinate and make sure that we get branding, marketing, cross-marketing for the
Definitely. It was STRIDE money that got me started working on this research. So I have lots of kudos to my STRIDE family for putting me in a good position. So to talk about those STRIDE projects, we got started in this. We were talking as partners amongst a few of the universities, but I really got my start with MARTA as a partner, even as we were starting the research, because they were very, very worried about the transit ridership change they had seen. And I had been peeking at these numbers for a while, looking at things like the effect on WMATA and Maryland Transit and all these big systems that were down. And I had thought, oh, it's these big systems that were causing these changes in ridership. We started to take a look and found out that it wasn't just these systems. There was actually this endemic problem that was occurring where across all transit agencies, they were really seeing, almost all transit agencies, they were really seeing these decreases in ridership. And our home agency of MARTA was no different. Heavy rail is something that has reliably gone up in ridership over time. And they were seeing, 2 to even 5% decreases some years. And so MARTA really themselves had approached me because they were looking for a deeper understanding of who else in their peer group was experiencing these issues. Is it really just related to service, or was it something that was bigger than that? And so that's kind of what we had set out to do with some of the STRIDE research. So our transit agency partnerships in this, MARTA came forward right away. They had funding that was match money, and that was great. But I personally have worked with them for a long time, so they were an easy partnership for me. Getting them to contribute money was a big win. My word of advice there is if you work with an agency for a decade, eventually they may actually surprise you and come through and get a new research coordinator who can't wait to hand you some money for you to be able to look at some of their issues. So stick at it is my first word of advice. In addition to our partnership with MARTA, so that was money included, but also staff time, data sharing. Because they were providing money, they had a strong interest in giving us whatever it was we needed. We wanted to be looking at multiple agencies at the same time though, so we approached TriMet, Metro in Minneapolis, and Miami-Dade Transit, hoping to get data out of them. All three of them were fantastic. One of the things that we were asked to comment on is data sharing agreements. I never had to have a data sharing agreement with these agencies. They simply provided data in fantastic formats, worked with us to answer questions when things were messy. We were looking at passenger counter data, which is big data and notoriously dirty when you're trying to figure out various things about it. And all of these agencies were fantastic. So one of the things that I've found is if you continuously give them feedback, they knew they were one of 4 agencies and they wanted to see our results. They wanted to know, you know, how they compared to MARTA and TriMet and Miami in Minneapolis's case, and, you know, vice versa. And so as long as we were continuously providing them with, look at what we found, look at the graphs that we created, here's the things we did. And this gave us really good feedback throughout the process because they were constantly giving us this gut check of, wait a minute, something doesn't look right. And at the same time, they were looking at their peer agencies and seeing how they were doing. And it gave them some nice return on the investment of sharing that data with us. So that is to say, with these transit sharing agreements, we never had to enter into one with any of these agencies. More recently, I've been trying to do so because we've been trying to set up a longer term data sharing agreement. I would say that is one of the challenges, and I don't know that I have answers, is because we're trying to work with an agency who wants to a certain extent, limit our publishing ability, and a university that's saying, no, we can't do that. We're working with an agency who wants the university to take on liability, and a university, you know, in the legalese, because there's really no liability to be had through most of these studies. And a university who says, we're a state agency, we can't do that. That has been a very long, drawn out process. At the same time, some of the data that we've been using for some of the studies that we've been doing related to this were from one of the major TNCs. And we were not just looking for feedback sort of back and forth, but we were actually looking for concrete data on in some way trips that were being taken in the cities we were studying. And the TNC finally came through, but there were a lot of stipulations with that. And so I would say another word of advice is to be really open-minded, because sometimes that partner that you really, really want, there's a lot of strings attached. And if you're willing to spend the time to have the back and forth and work out all of those strings that are attached, you could get an amazing data set out of them that's not quite as great as what you hoped for, but is good enough that you could really take a look at an issue in a new way. And that's what happened to us with this TNC partner that we had. For anyone who doesn't work with TNCs a bunch, this is transportation network companies. So companies like Uber, Lyft, things like that. I can't specifically say the name of the company because of our data sharing agreement though. So I think I hit on most of the questions. I would say the only one that we were asked to talk about that I haven't hit on yet is COVID impacts. And I would say similar situations to Noreen, that we were working with transit agencies. And so because it was their day-to-day, they were pretty open to being a part of all of this, even after COVID. But transit agencies have been hit so hard with COVID that their time was suddenly very, very limited, and we had to work around that quite a bit. I saw Lily come back on, but I'm going to steal one more minute to talk about some of the other things that we've done with the non-STRIDE projects real quickly. I think I still have 1 minute left, so if not, you can cut me off. But I wanted to say a little bit about what we've outlined for our Transit Cooperative Research Program, because I'm hoping there's some lessons learned here about some things that we've outlined that I think are going to work really well and have so far. One thing I would say is I think that centers like STRIDE, we tend to, get an advisory committee for those centers or a steering committee, and we involve people right from day one when it's something really large. I would say with all of our research projects, a great tech transfer thing to do is to involve at least a couple of folks who, like, if you were a big enough project that you would have a steering committee, here's the first couple I would ask to be involved, and just bring them along the whole time. And that way you've always got this gut check of the realism in the research that you're doing when you interface with those folks. when we had a big project like this TCRP, we actually formally included tasks where we had circle back tasks where we would do expert interviews, where we would circle back to transit agencies to make sure that the research that we were outlining was what they needed, was what was going to be actionable for them. And we included in our final report things like an executive summary, really actionable reports, small things like social media blasts that would make it so that we had already created those materials we were going to need to be able to go to industry conferences, to do webinars, to send out Twitter alerts about any of the research results we had. And one of the other really important things that we did was our report was really, really short. It was very actionable, something that transit agencies could easily digest. And the actual papers were appendices because they didn't really care about all those things that we as researchers really want to do. They really care about, okay, how do we actually react to this stuff? So making your report be your high level stuff and then just including all of that academic research stuff as appendices, we felt was a much better way to do it. So I'm going to stop there and go to the next.
Thank you. All right, this is a local project that with national implications, I'll put it that way, that myself and Dr. Sisiapaku are working on here at UAB. And it's trying to examine the question of, in this age of real-time route guidance and smartphones, what do people really use when they're trying to find detour routes around some of these major projects? And let's see. So we took as a case study a major construction project here in Birmingham. And I'm just going to give a couple of minutes of background so it's clear where we're coming from. In blue is I-2059, and that runs through Birmingham, which is, if you can see my cursor, is right through here. The section through downtown Birmingham is elevated. And it's an old twin span structure through downtown. It reached the end of its service life, and DOT knew that they had to either rehab it or rebuild it. And the Alabama DOT made the decision that they were not going to phase construction or maintain access. They were simply going to shut down 1.5 miles of interstate through downtown for 1 year. Now, this 1.5 mile section carries about 160,000 vehicles a day, and it also provides some of the major access points downtown. So it was a lot of planning and a lot of worry went into it. You can see a picture there of the actual construction. It was going to mean a lot of traffic diverting through downtown, which had been formerly on the interstate. And there was also the desire to get a lot of the through traffic diverted onto a ring road, I-459, which goes around the city. So the Alabama DOT invested a lot of money working with the city and the Regional Planning Commission and planning for these detours. They developed detour plans depending on where you're coming from. They did a website that they maintained throughout. They did public service announcements, radio announcements, variable message signs, mobile message signs, even had a call center where people would call in to get information about the project, and they sent out text messages. Now, where we came in was we looked at all of this and all of this investment in getting the word out about these detours, and we're wondering, what were people actually using? And how much of this investment paid off and how much of it was well, not well used at all, if that's the case. So we approached the DOT and we wanted to look at what do people actually use to decide how to get around this. And we identified 4 stakeholders. The first was the Alabama DOT. Second was the city of Birmingham, since they had a lot of traffic running through downtown now that had not previously been on the surface streets. The Regional Planning Commission of Birmingham, which had done some of the modeling for the detour routes, and then a local transportation consultant, which was Sane Associates. And they were heavily involved in executing a lot of the retiming, some of the planning for the rerouting and the detour routes. So I'll go over the public sector stakeholders. I know other people in this talk today are going to also talk about that, so I won't belabor it. But we did approach Alabama DOT early. We asked them what they really would like to get out of a study like this, and they showed a lot of interest. In fact, they agreed to be the payer of the match for the project. And they said what they really wanted to know was how did their investment pay off and what do people actually use to decide on what detour routes they take. And what they would also like, they said, is if we could ask motorists as well, what forms of communication would they like to get in the future so that they have something to use planning going forward. So we were able to incorporate that part of it into the project. We do have a motorist survey that we're working through. And so we've added some questions to help gather that information for them. The city of Birmingham had a slightly different focus. They have actually a lot of excess roadway capacity in their downtown network. Like many cities, they've actually contracted a bit over the last decade. So they were less worried about that, but what they were worried about was how do they reach commercial vehicles? That was their big problem through this whole project. Excuse me, trucks that would get stranded downtown and be on roads they weren't supposed to be on. The Planning Commission said they were most interested in how their modeling compared to what actually occurred as far as detour routes. And then this last one, the consultant is the one I'll focus on most here because it was a little unusual. They had a lot of great data. They were involved in the planning of the detour routes. They were involved in data collection during the construction project to monitor how things were going. They were involved in signal retiming. They had gathered quite a lot of data. And so we contacted them and they agreed to help us out. But they are, after all, a private company. They're a for-profit company. And so the first meeting was great. The second meeting, I'd say, was cordial. And by the third meeting, you kind of got the feeling we'd worn out our welcome. And they weren't going to put a whole lot more effort into this stuff. But we felt what they had and what they could contribute would really be helpful to the project. So we went back to the Alabama DOT and the Regional Planning Commission and started asking them, was there a way we could find funding to bring SANE back into the program, not under us, but under them, so that they could get even more out of the project and hit some more points that we can't quite hit given our limited scope. And so the Regional Planning Commission did come back and agreed to pony up some money very generously. And they're in the process of working that contracting out right now, but that's going to bring SANE Associates into the fold and give them now an incentive to work with us closely and compile even more data and hopefully deliver a much better product through the joint efforts. It's really two projects now, but we're working close together. So that was unusual. That was not something we expected going into the project. But it's really worked out nicely, and I guess that just falls into the it never hurts to ask when it comes to working with stakeholders. Very quickly, what works, a lot of the stuff that previous speakers said, prior relationships are just critical, and I don't think that really probably applies to this group of more senior researchers, but certainly with young faculty, that's something to stress the importance of. One of the things I hear from DOT people all the time is that they'll come in one morning and they'll get a proposal sitting on their desk written by somebody they've never met on a topic they don't know anything about, and they've been asked to review it. And it helps when you talk to that person first. And so with all of our stakeholders, we hit them in the pre-proposal stage and got their input and hopefully made a product that they all feel is going to offer value to them. And it really has helped through the cooperation. And then, like other speakers have also said, regular communication throughout. I think Carrie said, every time you find something interesting or something new, give them a call, send them a little email with a chart or a map or whatever, and it really keeps people engaged. We're not yet at the point of presenting final findings, but we will try to make the final report really geared toward the people who will ultimately be using and adopting this information rather than the academic format. What have been challenges? Finding that right contact and hopefully finding someone who's at a high enough level that they can really help you. We've had some trouble obtaining all the data we want. You may have some good contacts in a public agency, but maybe a piece of data you need is in another department that's headed by someone who's a lot less enthusiastic about your project than you are or their colleague is. So having someone high enough up that you can start dropping some names certainly doesn't hurt. Satisfying everyone, we got a lot of input at the beginning. We could not tailor a project or a scope that was going to give everybody what they wanted. but we tried to make sure we were bringing value, at least to some degree, to everyone involved. And of course, obtaining the funding for the consultant, that was jumping through a lot of hoops, but in the end, it's been very positive. Last comment is on COVID. So far, we have not seen any real change to our stakeholder involvement or interactions. And I don't know if we will going forward. We've really maintained good contact with everyone via Zoom or webcam or whatever. So it's overall been a very positive experience. And I think even 6 months in, we still have a lot of enthusiasm among the stakeholders. And that's me.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Shilei Zhao, assistant professor in transportation engineering at the University of Florida. So today I want to share some of my very short experience about engaging industry partners. So so everything got started with my ongoing STRIDE project, which got started last year in November. It's about micromobility as a solution to reduce urban traffic congestion. From this project, so I started to reach out to industry partners and have some successful stories that I could share today. So for many of you, the questions you might have in mind is, so how can I get connected to industry partners? So I want to share my personal experience with you about SPIN, which is owned by Ford and Bird. So both of them are two leading micromobility operators in the United States. So when I was a postdoc at the University of Michigan, so I used to work with Ford for less than a year. So at this year's TRB, so I got reconnected with a Ford contact who I used to work with. And he was very interested, he was very impressed by my presentation and very interested in our ongoing STRIDE project in micromobility. So based on our conversation at TRB, so I quickly followed up with him after the TRB and got the first meeting among our team, the Ford policy research team, and the SPIN team. So then everything got started over there. So my Bird experience is actually very different from Ford. So when I started to conduct the micromobility project, the STRIDE project, so I was actively seeking inputs from industry partners, especially from the major operators. So I came across a news article on UC Berkeley interviewing the Bird's manager for Office of Sustainability on a website, which I forgot which one though. So from that article, I got to know their manager for the Office of Sustainability. So I tried to add her on LinkedIn, and through my contact with her, so I sent her a small note with a brief summary of our ongoing STRIDE project to see if she would like to offer some suggestions for our research, or serve as a external advisory board. So she was kind of interested at the beginning and helped coordinated a first meeting among our team and the Bird's policy research team. So that's how I started my conversation with Bird. So I think the main takeaways here is, I think conferences and meetings are very important venues to get connected or reconnected to key stakeholders, especially for junior faculties like me. A good presentation will definitely attract people's attention and gain interest into your research. I think I have this kind of feeling, not only for this project, I also have similar feeling for my other ongoing project or potential project in the future. People will always get attracted for a very good presentation and want to follow up with you with potential funding opportunities. Secondly, I want to say social media nowadays actually can play a very important role in the research, especially in my research. So I use social media to reach out to different parties, such as industry partners, communities, vendors, researchers who might be interested in collaboration, etc. It actually works out pretty well in many cases. So for social media platforms, I recommend LinkedIn, Twitter, and ResearchGate from my personal experience. So after I was able to get connected with them, so we can set up a first meeting to discuss our common interests, to identify their needs and incorporate those into our research objective. So I would say the first call is very, very important. So the first thing they will ask, so based on my experience, they will ask about what you have done in this area. So in my case, it's micromobility. So I think it's a good way to prepare a short version and a long version about your research project. So the stakeholders may not be interested in all your projects or ongoing research efforts or directions, but they might definitely ask questions regarding the ones they are interested in. So, so don't put everything too long, have a short version for each one of the research topics and prepare a longer version for each one in case they are interested in some of them. So then the next thing they will do is they will introduce what they are currently working on in this area. So when they are introducing their work, so we need to be engaged in the conversation and ask good questions to understand their research needs and connect these needs to our ongoing research effort or our future research goals to let them see there's a potential that we can work together on certain research topic. So if everything goes very well, so they will ask you to put together a 1 to 2 page scope of work or a short research proposal by the end of the first meeting, based on my experience. So I think, so that's kind of the first call. So after the first call, so we definitely need to do next is to do a follow-up. So I would say timely follow-up with the stakeholders to keep them engaged is very important. So even though follow-up sounds very easy, but in my opinion, it's the most challenging part for me. I think from my past experience, I picked up, I think you don't want to be too aggressive nor too passive. So with my current experience, a week or so seems to be a good time frame to follow up. We also want to constantly share our new research findings with them to keep them interested. So when like Carrie and other people talk about, so when the opportunities comes, they will think of us first to conduct such research. So that's a quick summary of my ongoing effort with engaging industry partners. So I think unlike public entities, so COVID-19 definitely bring a huge impact on my stakeholder engagement with industry partners because they are for-profit organizations. So COVID and COVID-related impacts bring significant economic burden to those companies. So we actually already negotiated a contract with Ford and got pre-approved. Because of they currently have the funding freeze, they cannot release the fund to us and we have to wait. So the research got delayed with Ford. And on the Bird side, so we have a pre-agreed data sharing plan at the beginning. But in May, they had a big layoff. I think they cut 400 employees and they have a significant reduced the funding for research at Bird. So now data sharing is not their top priority, so which make our research progress much slower. And also because of COVID-19, so a lot of cities have delayed deployment of new micromobility vehicles on their streets. For example, Birmingham and Gainesville. Because of those disruptions, so the data collection got delayed as well, and which definitely impact our research progress. So that's everything I want to talk about today. Thank you very much, and I welcome any questions.
So it's a collaboration between the City of Gainesville, Florida Department of Transportation, and University of Florida. So I have been the iStreet testbed manager for the last 1 year. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I've been at iStreet testbed manager for the past 1 year. So I will talk about my experience. So, I'll give a quick overview of our program. So under iStreet, what we do is we implement solutions from transportation research and we evaluate emerging technologies. So we do all aspects of, we deliver all aspects of a CAV research from innovation to implementation to evaluation. And these are some of the example projects that you can see from our program. So some of the ongoing projects are a SPAT and map project called Gainesville Trapezium. In the green here in the figure, we also have a autonomous shuttle in Gainesville and so on. So I have incorporated on what on Dean gave us the points on Dean gave us, and I've put them into 5 different categories. I will talk about each of these categories and our experiences working with DOT, the city, and the industry partners. So the first point is communication. I think everybody stressed upon on the first part, like having a clear and effective communication channel, and identifying all the points of contacts and so on. One thing that we do in the iStreet program is that we have quarterly meetings. We have 2 different kinds of quarterly meetings. One, it's more topics focused or theme based. So for example, like the upcoming iStreet stakeholder quarterly meeting is going to be on focusing on data analytics. So we have the regular cast. So like we have the DOT folks, us at the UF and city on all of these meetings, but we invite different industry partners or academic researchers based on the theme of those stakeholder meetings. And the second type of quarterly meetings we do is more strategy oriented or big picture oriented. So what we do is we talk with a select small group of individuals from all the stakeholders, and we talk about like, okay, how are we going to take the iStreet program into the future? Like, what are the options for us to grow? What is going to be our blueprint going forward, right? So some of the things you have to do in this is trying to understand the goals, because what is success is not same for a state or a local agency to a research institute. So you try to understand. Usually DOT is very keen, and they prioritize everything related to safety. We might be interested to look at other aspects as well. And so what you do is you try to understand what success is from all these parties, and try to come up with a plan or a blueprint to go forward. So you identify key elements in each of these meetings, and you prepare the action plan for the next quarter. And based on these, so you have to, since CAV is such a evolving area and things keep changing, so you have to reflect that in your branding and messaging and in your outreach. And it's important to understand what each of the stakeholders are experiencing. And like one of the things we find out is that it doesn't register easily that iStreet is a real world test bed. Like we don't have a closed track for testing where we do CAV testing. It's our actual roads. So that's a simple thing as that can get lost in messaging when there's no clarity. And again, there needs to be clarity in terms of roles and responsibility, not only at the program level, also in terms of each and every project. So like a couple of examples I can give you is like one of the projects, we are getting a lot of pedestrian detection and warning devices. So we have to work with the university facilities folks, and we have to work with the DOT district offices to make sure they have the rights to come to our roads and work on that. So and similarly for the trapezium project, we have a number of onboard devices put on our UF fleet vehicles. So need to define who is responsible for what, and make sure that is clear. Data management and data agreements as we have discussed previously. So we need to understand like where is the data coming from, who has the access to it, and who's going to store it, and all that. So there needs to be a clarity in terms of roles and responsibilities. In terms of data agreements, one of the experience that I can share is it's easier if the entity or the industry partner who is providing the data is also a part of the project, and the data sharing is written into the agreement before, as opposed to having a separate data agreement. So one of the examples I can give you is like we are working on evaluating 2 different shuttles, one in Gainesville. Both of them autonomous shuttle, one in Gainesville, one in Lake Nona. So one in Gainesville, we don't have to have a separate data sharing agreement because it's already part of the bigger agreement. And the one in Lake Nona, we are working on a separate data agreement because it's not part of an ongoing project. It's a separate deal we are making. The next thing is consultation. So it's very important, once you have the scope and you start working on it, there are many things that change over the project period that you can consult with your project managers and your stakeholders and make changes as necessary then and there. For example, COVID-19 has been a big change for everyone here. So we have a couple of different projects where we had to conduct focus groups. So we had to immediately move on to virtual focus groups. And we were able to talk to our project managers and make those changes quickly and carry that out. One of the other things we had was, not all the project ideas you get doesn't have to be a standalone project. So for example, we had funding from DOT already to do focus groups and surveys on perception of older adults on autonomous technologies. So at the same time, we were talking to a company called Beep, who run autonomous shuttle at Lake Nona here in Florida. So what we realized was, like, we can add an evaluation component, and we can add that bit as an additional task to the existing project, as opposed to reinvent the wheel and create a separate project for that. So this can happen when you are constantly in touch with your stakeholders and you're consulting and looking at it from a big picture. So the next thing is managing expectations and priorities. It's always important to listen and check in and ask. So when you're working under a big program like an iStreet program where you have a number of projects running, you're working with different project managers, different stakeholders, and industry partners. So everyone has their own way of doing things. Some are more hands-on than the others. So it's always important to go back to them and check and make sure that they are happy with what you're doing, and if not, how you can make things better. Another example I can give you is, so with the city of Gainesville, for example, so when COVID happened, like, they were, all their schedules got messed up. Their priority is always to make sure that their buses run smoothly. So at that time, even though we are doing a couple of projects with them, you have to understand that it may be a priority for you. It's not for them. So you have to find your windows to approach them at the right time and to get things done. One of the other things they told us when we're trying to do a survey is that they had already done a survey with the certain area in the city, and they wanted to make sure that there is no respondent fatigue. So although their project is completely different than yours, so having that respect and understanding their priorities and their expectations and working with them is helpful from a long-term relationship point of view. Yeah, so that comes to the last point, which is building relationships. Although it doesn't look that good in photos, like, we do have very good relationship with our stakeholders, and end of the day, like, when the priorities don't exactly line up and you have minor or major conflicts, it's always good to take a step back and look at things from a long-term relationship perspective. That usually helps to solve a lot of problems. So that's my time, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now or later.
I'd like to thank all of the speakers. We had a wonderful collection of very diverse projects, but I think what's interesting is we had some really common threads between all of them in terms of how we can effectively engage stakeholders. So I'm really grateful to all of you for sharing your experiences, and I hope that everyone on the call has an opportunity to learn and get some tips from those. So what we'd like to do now is do a brief overview of what happens on our end at UF in terms of your project, in terms of you're collecting your report information and then communicating outputs and outcomes and impacts from your projects. So the first thing is there are two different reports that will track stakeholder engagement. The first is your quarterly report, which everyone should be pretty familiar with. And this quarterly report includes information that's really important for us in terms of tracking how you're engaging stakeholders throughout the whole project. So we'll go through that a little bit more with Inez in just a few minutes. We're also going to be starting a final technology transfer report. Basically, this is accumulation of all of what you've put into your previous quarterly reports. So I'll be working with PIs. We don't want to add extra work to your to you, but we do want to make sure that we capture at the end of your project everything that you've done in technology transfer, especially since many of the things that you do happen towards the end of the project. So we'll touch on that more later as well. Just some important reminders. We want to make sure that you always emphasize outputs, outcomes, and impacts. These are the 3 areas that USDOT really wants to see. These are our metrics, and those are also used for reports to Congress when they do summaries of projects from UTCs. If you are just starting a project, we recommend that you hold your first stakeholder meeting. If you haven't yet, make sure you hold it within the first quarter of your project and really work on clearly identifying needs if you haven't done that already. So then your first quarterly report, you are reporting on a stakeholder meeting. And ultimately what we want for everybody is that whatever information, products that are created from your project, we want to see those being used and out in the world. And so that's really what we want to help with. Just really quick, everybody I think already knows this, but when you complete your project or get close to completing it, we would like to host a Stride webinar to help get the word out on what you achieved in your project. We do a lot of publicizing of these webinars. We do it through our UFTI Constant Contact, social media, LinkedIn. We also distribute the webinar announcement on CUTSI listserv, and we provide that information to USDOT, and they list it on their webinar list of UTC webinars. What we'd like you to do is to make sure that you're sending announcements of your webinars to your state DOT contacts, to any TRB committees that you are a part of that you think would be interested in this particular project, and any social media that you are engaged with. So this really helps us to make sure that we're getting the word out. We do record all webinars, so we can also distribute the recordings. The last thing is that we want to communicate your work in a variety of different ways. So we're going to touch on each of these. We have a website page for each project. We're also going to be developing project briefs, and we use social media. So what I'd like to do is, go onto our website so you can see what the website looks like. Okay, where's my... Okay, so here we have a sample page. My screen's a little small. So here's a sample page of a completed project. This is Dr. Whalen's project, what we call Project 02 internally. A completed project page on the Stride website will have the title, the research team. It will have links to the UTC project info, which is required. Also, the technology transfer report will be linked to it, and the final report. And on this page, we provide a brief project description. This should be written in a way that everybody can understand it, especially like if you have someone who is from a member of Congress, that they could actually look at this and understand it. We list your products what was created in the project, who can benefit from it, and what are the broader impacts as well from your project. And lastly, we provide a link to the webinar. So any webinars that you create, we'll provide a link to. We are going to be creating project briefs for each project. The goal here is to have a 2-page, easy to read summary of every project. And this actually is reflecting, I think, similar to what Carrie mentioned, in that we want something that's really digestible, very high level, that can be distributed more widely than, say, the final reports, and that's easy to read and understandable. This is the first one that Inez and I have been working on. We're going to be sharing these with the PIs so that they can make sure that everything is accurate, they can edit it, but we wanted to share with you the layout of how we're planning on currently making it look. So in the beginning, there'll be a project overview. We'll provide impacts, who benefits, what were the research goals, simply what were the findings, and then also what were the products that were created. So here you can see we're going to bring some edit to this. So this project brief will also provide a link to on our website as well.
Hello everyone. What I'd like to do is provide an overview of the first section of the progress report and explain why we require the information we do. The tech transfer section will be discussed further on down by Dean. We also wanted to remind everyone that since most of STRIDE projects are multi-institutional and have different tasks associated with them, the progress report should include information on each of those tasks and from each of those researchers associated with the project and submitted to the STRIDE Center by the lead PI. Okay, so let's begin with section 2, the COVID-19 questions. We added these based off an initial request from USDOT related to how transportation research has been impacted or could be impacted by COVID-19. We have since decided to keep these questions in the progress report to continue monitoring throughout the COVID-19 crisis. So what we ask for you to do is to continue to update this section as necessary each reporting period. And many thanks to those who have done this so far. Section 3, the task by task activities. This is an important section for us because it has a lot to do also. It helps us with the invoicing. But of course, it also helps us determine that the project is in progress. So in this section, what we are looking for is a detailed update for each task in narrative form, of course, of the activities that took place during the quarter, including any results that you have achieved during the last quarter. It's also very useful for us, and important in fact, if each of the tasks include the name of the person that is leading it and anyone else associated with that specific task, if applicable. As I said, this section is very important to us because it helps us with the approval of the invoices. What happens is that for each researcher working on a project, we receive an invoice from their university. And in order to release that invoice for payment, we must certify that work is in progress, completed. And so how do we do this? We do this by going back to the progress reports and taking a look at each task and the person associated with that task. And that helps us make that connection with the invoice from the specific school. All right, moving on to section 4. Actually, the next sections 4, 5, and 6. These have been specifically designed to pull information for our performance metrics and the semi-annual report that is due to USDOT. Okay, section 4, accomplishments. In this section, we want you to list awards, publications, presentations, etc. Associated with your project. First of all, what you want to do is keep this as a running list, so leave any information from the previous quarters in there. But you want to add new information here and highlight this information. As you can see, there's a drop-down menu for you to choose from, but we also ask that you provide the date and the specifics in the detailed description column. That seems pretty straightforward, but again, just want to remind you that our performance indicator spreadsheet is structured in such a way that providing this information in the progress report helps us to populate for for some, it helps us to populate those spreadsheets for these reports due to USDOT. Moving on to section 5, the students. Again, this is a random list where we ask that any new additions be highlighted per quarter. And so we can report to USDOT and populate our spreadsheets. As you can see, what we need you to add in the columns are their names, the university where the student is from, their email address, and in the columns, in the degree and funding columns, you can choose from a drop-down menu, as you can see there. We also want to know for how long they will be funded or were funded for, and the expected date of graduation or when they graduate. Those. Section 6, this is the participants and collaborators section. Here again is another running list. Keep the previous information in, but highlight any new information for the quarter. As in the accomplishments and students section, this is used to populate our metrics for USDOT. What we ask here is for you to give us the name or to include the name of your collaborator. So who has been involved with your project. And you can choose from the drop-down menus for the type of information, where they were located, and the type of contribution they are providing. As you can see, we've added stakeholder in the column because we recognize that stakeholder is a collaborator. However, the difference we'd like to point out, and that Ondine will go more into detail in the tech transfer section, is that here we want you to list who they are, and in the tech transfer section, we want you to tell us how you're engaging with that stakeholder specific. Moving on to section 7, data management plan. So here, every STRIDE project from year 2 and on has been required to include a data management plan in their proposals. This was a new requirement set by USDOT. All we are asking here is for you to notify us if there's been any major deviation from your DMP. If there has been, just specify, be specific with it, and let us know what the deviation is or how it's different, and we will file this as an internal amendment to your proposal. Section 8, modifications. This section, we intended it for you to notify us, for example, if you need a no-cost extension on your project. This is also a good place to include your justification for that extension. Many times, PIs will include in this area, in the section, that they need an extension, but we don't have a reason why. So I end up just following up with people and asking them to provide a justification. So if you do it in this section, that'll save a little bit of time, but of course we will always, we will review and contact you as needed. This section 9, this section should be structured very much like number 3, the task by task activities. This is what we want you to let us know what you're going to do in the next quarter. We simply ask for the PI to describe the work to be done on each task in the next quarter, listing the name of the researcher and team along with the task. And this completes the overview of the first section of the progress report. I'd like to invite you to send us suggestions or comments on how we can streamline this process for you and for us to make the reporting process each quarter a bit more efficient. Although I'll talk about the tech transfer section. Thank you.
Thank you, Inez. So on each quarterly progress report, you have a section for tech transfer. And this includes the outputs, outcomes, and impacts that we are reporting to USDOT. So by the end of your project, we should have a completed table that shows exactly how many outputs, outcomes, and impacts your project has achieved. On a quarterly basis, we recognize that many of these items may not be completed until towards the end of your project. However, there's one area, the stakeholder section, that we hope to have regular updates on from you. So this table summarizes all of the numeric metrics that we hope to achieve, and then at the bottom, after that, are the narratives for each one. So the product narrative, basically we'd like a description of what the product is or products are of your research project. We recognize that most projects are not going to be developing a new technology per se, but you may be developing a new methodology, an algorithm, a process. And so those are products that we want reported here. And this is very important for USDOT to see that research is actually being applied in a way that can be used out in the field. The next is a body of knowledge and professionals trained. So what we mean here is any specific trainings that you are providing for transportation professionals. We include in this STRIDE webinars. So if you do a STRIDE webinar, that counts as one training, and we'll count the number of professionals that are trained in that webinar. We typically do not include conference presentations in here. We will include if you have a specific training or workshop at a conference, but not just a general presentation. If you have a webinar that you've implemented in some other venue, maybe a lunch and learn at a specific stakeholders office, perhaps a webinar through TRB that's related to your project, we can also include those in this category. Number 4 is the one section of the tech transfer quarterly report that we hope to see regular updates on. So when you engage with your stakeholders, we'd like to have a summary of how that stakeholder engagement happened. So this part of the table, we'd like you to first include who from STRIDE, who from your project was participating in the meeting, when it occurred, what type of activity it was. And so for instance, an in-person meeting, a phone meeting, a demonstration, or some other kind of interaction, the location, and who the stakeholders are that you're interacting with. So these, ideally we'd like a name of a stakeholder, but if you can't provide the name, at least the organization and the person's position so that we have a sense of who actually you're meeting with. And then also what's really important is a narrative description. So what actually happened at this meeting? Did you discuss the needs of your stakeholder? Did you discuss barriers to adoption? Did you provide data, a data update, and then get input on the data that you're collecting? Did the trajectory of your research change slightly because of input from the stakeholder? So that's the kind of information we'd like in the narrative description. The last couple sections, again, we don't expect regular updates on. We imagine that these will probably be filled in primarily at the end of your project, but any adoption and implementation that occurred with the products. So who's going to be using your products? Has anybody agreed to use it, to test it out, to pilot it? That's where you provide this information. And lastly, broader impacts. So these are looking at how overall, if your product was adopted or implemented, what it would achieve in terms of congestion mitigation. So we recognize that these broader impacts probably are not things that you've directly measured, but you can provide information on what you anticipate the impacts would be if your product was adopted. So this is the quarterly report. Next, I'd like to show you the final tech transfer report. So now I'd like to show you an example of a completed technology transfer final report. So this is identical to the quarterly report template with the exception of one addition, and that is the project description. So for this section, we would like a very straightforward, easy to understand description of the problem that your project was trying to address, how you addressed it, and any products or solutions that you came up with, any findings. A lot of times this project description can be taken from the abstract or executive summary of your report, or it can be edited for simplicity from those two sections. We'll work with you to try to make sure that this project description is easy to understand. Basically, this is really important because we'll be using this project description in a number of ways. We'll be using it for constant contact, for the website updates, and for the project brief. The remaining sections of the tech transfer report are identical to the quarterly report. We have our metrics table, but in the final report, we want this completed with all of the numbers of each that you have done. We want a completed product description. So this product description, again, should be something that could be understood by a member of the public. If you have a technical description, you can provide that as well. We do want a couple of sentences to describe what your product does. So we really want to understand it, not just have, you know, a phrase or a couple of words. For section 4, body of knowledge and professionals trained, this is where we'll actually provide the detailed information on the webinars that you have or any specific trainings and the number of professionals who participated. Stakeholder engagement. In this section, we want to compile all stakeholder engagement that you've held for your project. So hopefully we'll have numerous meetings that will be listed here showing how you've engaged with your stakeholders throughout your project. For adoption and implementation, if you have numerous products, we'd like to understand how each of those products may be implemented or adopted by a stakeholder. And if it hasn't been adopted yet, how you anticipate it may be or how you plan to encourage adoption in the future. And lastly, broader impacts. We recognize that broader impacts aren't something that we're going to be able to measure in the time span of your project. However, we'd like to understand if your product was adopted, what would the impact of that be on congestion mitigation? And that concludes our tech transfer report section. Now I'd like to move towards questions. And maybe if you have questions, you can write them in the chat box, or we'll allow people to go ahead and unmute if you have them, if you haven't had a chance to write something into the chat box. And Dr. Lilly, yes.
This is Michael Hunter, just a quick question. For the stakeholder meetings, if the meeting is with your DOT or something like that, and you're asking for data that you're going to use on the project that you're hoping they're going to use, does that count like if you're asking them for things?
Yes, I think so. I don't know if Dr. Lilly, if you have anything you'd like to chime in. I think any engagement that you're having and you're trying to work with them is useful. And then if for some reason we feel like, okay, we're not going to include that particular one in a progress report, we may not include it, but we'd like to have any kind of interaction you have with the stakeholder.
Yes, I agree. Just let us know, make sure that you report everything, even if it's just a request. Well, I guess as everybody is thinking about this, I just want to say, just as a reminder, of course, the stakeholder engagement it's a requirement by the USDOT. We have to report it. It's going to count not only in our performance indicators, but also for competition in the future. I think what's important is to remember from what I learned from the presentations, the 5 presentations, and thank you, by the way, great job, was that by having stakeholder engagement, you are increasing the relevance of your research. You're going to strengthen the application possibilities. You're going to have more relevant data. The effort that is required, which is frequent communication, networking, reaching out whenever you can, whenever it's relevant, pays dividends in the long run. It may take a while, but if you persist, you will have the fruits of your labor will show later, not only just for Stride, but for each of your careers. There are, of course, some challenges, but in the end, it's definitely worth it. And I speak from personal experience. Once you have that kind of a network, you build those types of relationships. You never know where it's going to lead. Sometimes it leads to additional funding even. I see that there's a comment here. Session has been very helpful. Thank you. And again, this has been recorded, so make sure that you share with your colleagues. All right. Again, once again, I want to thank the presenters. I want to thank all of you for listening in, and please share with your colleagues that this is now available. And thanks, Undine, for organizing this.